A vast stone city rises from the African savanna, built without mortar over 8 centuries ago. This is Great Zimbabwe, a monument to a lost kingdom of immense wealth and power. By the end of this story, you will understand the true origins of this African marvel and the secrets its silent walls still guard. We will uncover why a thriving metropolis was mysteriously abandoned and explore the astonishing global trade network it once commanded. What forgotten stories do you think these ancient stones are waiting to tell? The silence of the stones was first broken by outsiders in the late 19th century. A German explorer named Karl Moch pushed through the dense brush and stood before the soaring walls, his mind reeling with disbelief. He simply could not accept that local African people were responsible for such a monumental achievement. In his own writings, he desperately searched for another explanation, convinced he had found the palace of the biblical Queen of Sheba. This was not an isolated thought. Other European settlers and so-called experts, blinded by the racial prejudices of the era, concocted wild theories. They argued that Phoenician traders or a lost tribe of Israel must have been the true builders. These colonial narratives were a deliberate theft of history, an attempt to strip a magnificent African accomplishment from its rightful creators. Why was it so difficult for them to accept the truth that stood right before their eyes? The very mystery of Great Zimbabwe was now wrapped in a second, more insidious layer of confusion, one born not from a lack of evidence but from a refusal to see it. This foundational bias would shape the study of the site for decades, sending researchers down countless wrong paths. The most breathtaking proof of this indigenous genius stands in a place called the Great Enclosure. Its outer wall is a staggering curve of granite, a monumental ribbon of stone that soars over 30 feet high in places and runs for nearly 800 feet in length. What makes this wall truly miraculous is that it was built without a single drop of mortar. The builders meticulously selected and shaped thousands of granite blocks, fitting them together with such precision that even after centuries, you cannot slide a knife blade between the stones. This dry stone technique created structures strong enough to withstand the elements and earthquakes, a testament to an engineering knowledge that was both profound and perfectly adapted to its environment. But this was not mere brute force construction. Look closer at the walls and you will see artistry woven into the stone. Running along the top of the Great Wall are decorative bands, intricate patterns of chevrons and herringbone. These are not random scratches. The chevron, a repeating V-shape, and the herringbone, a pattern of slanted parallel lines, were carefully and deliberately set into the facade. They required immense skill to execute, turning a formidable defensive barrier into a thing of beauty, a clear statement that the people of Great Zimbabwe valued aesthetics as much as they did strength. Within this massive complex, one structure stands as the central enigma, the iconic Conical Tower. This solid tower, over 30 feet tall, mirrors the shape of the grain bins used by the Shona people for centuries. But why build a solid, immovable stone replica of a granary? Some believe it was a powerful symbol of the kingdom's wealth and prosperity, a permanent declaration that the rulers here held the power to feed their people. Others suggest it held a deep spiritual significance, perhaps representing the connection between the rulers and their ancestors. Its true purpose remains one of the site's most captivating mysteries, a silent monument that refuses to give up all its secrets. Every stone in the Great Enclosure whispers of a society that had mastered its world, blending raw power with refined artistry in a way that still commands our awe today. Rising above the Great Enclosure, the granite dome of the hill complex commands the entire landscape. This is the ancient heart of the city, the very place where the story of Great Zimbabwe began. Perched nearly 300 feet above the valley, its weathered stones are the oldest on the site, whispering of the first settlers who saw the potential in this powerful place. Reaching the summit requires a climb up a narrow, stone-lined passage, a journey that would have felt both physical and spiritual. At the top, you are greeted not by a single palace, but by a series of enclosures and platforms intricately built amongst the natural granite boulders. The structures here are believed to have been royal residences and sacred ritual spaces, physically separating the rulers from the people below and reinforcing their elevated status in every sense of the word. From this lofty perch, the king and his court held a strategic advantage, able to see for miles across the savannah. They could monitor approaching trade caravans long before they arrived and survey the sprawling city and its farmlands below. This was not just a defensive position, it was a statement of control. But the hill complex was far more than a fortress. Archaeological evidence points to its role as the spiritual core of the kingdom. Within its walls, rituals were performed to honor ancestral spirits and to seek their guidance for the prosperity of the state. The very fusion of royal authority with deep spiritual belief made this hill the undeniable political and religious heart of the entire kingdom, a place where power was not just exercised but sanctified. What must it have felt like to stand here at the city's peak, looking down upon a thriving metropolis that you commanded, both by royal decree and by divine right? Below the royal hill and the soaring walls of the Great Enclosure, the city spread out into a bustling landscape of life and activity. A series of smaller, yet still impressive, walled compounds dot the valley floor. These are the valley enclosures, and they were the prestigious neighborhoods of Great Zimbabwe's upper class. While the king presided from the sacred hill, the city's wealthy merchants, powerful officials, and elite families lived here, surrounded by stone walls that marked their status. The very layout of the city tells a story of a highly structured society. The higher you lived on the hill, the closer you were to spiritual and political power, while the elite in the valley enjoyed a life of comfort and influence just a step below royalty. Walking through the ruins of these enclosures, you can almost sense the vibrant community that thrived here. Archaeologists have uncovered the foundations of round, mud brick houses known as dogger huts, which once stood within these stone-walled yards. The artifacts found here paint a vivid picture of daily life for the fortunate few. Fragments of elegant pottery, some locally made and others imported from distant shores, suggest a taste for the finer things. Spindle whorls used for spinning thread point to a thriving textile industry, while tools for working ivory and soapstone reveal the presence of skilled artisans crafting luxury goods. These enclosures were not isolated fortresses, but interconnected spaces with pathways and open areas that would have allowed for social gatherings and the bustling exchange of goods and gossip. The evidence speaks of a complex community where social standing was displayed not just by the height of your walls, but by the objects you owned and the crafts you supported. Why did such a prosperous society, with its clear social layers and thriving elite, eventually choose to leave all of this behind? The answer may lie not within these comfortable homes, but in the very source of the city's incredible wealth. The source of this incredible wealth lay far beyond the valley walls, in a global trade network that stretched across the Indian Ocean. While the elite lived comfortably within their stone enclosures, the kingdom's true power was built on its control of a resource more precious than gold: ivory. Great Zimbabwe sat at the heart of a vast commercial empire, its influence reaching the distant coasts of modern-day Kenya and Tanzania. From these Swahili city-states, goods from across the world flowed inland, destined for the royal court. Chinese celadon pottery, Persian faience bowls, and glass beads from India and the Middle East have all been unearthed from the ruins. These exotic items were not just trinkets, they were symbols of immense economic power and global connection. In exchange, the kingdom exported the riches of the African interior, primarily vast quantities of ivory and gold. The rulers of Great Zimbabwe mastered this trade, acting as the central hub that connected the interior's resources with the cosmopolitan markets of the coast. They grew immensely wealthy by taxing the goods that passed through their territory, accumulating the capital needed to fund the construction of their stunning stone city and support a specialized class of artisans, priests, and administrators. This was not an isolated African kingdom, but a sophisticated player in a medieval global economy. How could a civilization so powerful and so connected simply vanish from the world stage? The answer to who built this stunning city has always been clear to those willing to listen. The builders were the ancestors of the Shona people, whose communities still live in the region today. The evidence for this is overwhelming and comes from multiple independent sources. Archaeologically, we can trace a direct cultural lineage. The first Bantu-speaking farmers in the area, known as the Gokoma culture, began settling the Zimbabwean plateau around 2,000 years ago. Over centuries, their societies grew more complex, developing the skills in agriculture, trade, and social organization that would eventually culminate in the rise of Great Zimbabwe. This was not a sudden invention, but the slow, deliberate flowering of a local tradition. The most compelling evidence, however, comes from the living culture. The modern Shona language is filled with words and oral traditions that directly reference the site and its structures. Their spiritual beliefs, which center on the veneration of ancestral spirits, perfectly align with the ritual objects and sacred spaces found within the hill complex. Even the iconic soapstone bird carvings found on monoliths at the site are understood within Shona tradition as symbolic messengers between the spiritual and physical worlds. These are not vague similarities, they are a direct cultural inheritance. The stone building technique itself, that masterful dry stone masonry, did not disappear. It continued as a living tradition, seen in the smaller, later stone enclosures built by Shona chiefs across the region for centuries after Great Zimbabwe's decline. The city was not built by foreigners, but was the magnificent achievement of a sophisticated African civilization that had deep, enduring roots in the soil upon which it stood. The kingdom's wealth was not hidden in the ground, but flowed along well-trodden trade routes that stretched for thousands of miles. Great Zimbabwe's true power came from its brilliant position at the very center of a vast economic web. The city's rulers did not just passively receive goods, they actively controlled the movement of the continent's most sought-after treasures. From the rivers to the west, they channeled gold panned from rich alluvial deposits. From the interior came immense quantities of ivory, the tusks of elephants that roamed the savannah, and from northern mines came copper, a vital metal for tools, ornaments, and currency. These raw materials of African wealth were funneled directly through the city, making it the undisputed commercial hub of the entire region. This was not a local market, but a global enterprise. The destination for these goods was the Swahili coast, a string of sophisticated port cities like Kilwa and Sofala. Here, African merchants met Arab dhows, those iconic sailing ships with their triangular lateen sails. These vessels became the cargo trucks of the medieval Indian Ocean, carrying their precious loads across the sea. In exchange for gold and ivory, they brought back luxuries that signified global connection. Fragments of fine Chinese celadon pottery and vibrant Persian glassware found at the site are not mere artifacts, they are proof of a city with cosmopolitan tastes. Indian cotton cloth and shimmering glass beads would have adorned the elite, visible symbols of a wealth that reached across oceans. The rulers of Great Zimbabwe grew immensely rich by mastering this system. They did not need to conquer the coast, they simply controlled the gate. By taxing every caravan that passed through their territory, they accumulated the capital needed to fund their monumental building projects and support a thriving, specialized society. This flow of wealth allowed artisans to perfect their crafts, priests to perform their rituals, and administrators to manage the kingdom's complex affairs. The soaring stone walls were not just for defense, they were a physical declaration of this economic triumph, built literally from the profits of global trade. How could a civilization so deeply embedded in the world's economy, a central link in a chain that stretched from the African interior to the palaces of Asia. Ever allow that chain to break, this golden wealth was not simply found, but was torn from the earth with remarkable skill. Across the Zimbabwean plateau, archaeologists have identified thousands of ancient mines, deep pits and narrow shafts that plunge into the rock. These were not random holes in the ground. They were sophisticated operations, often following rich quartz veins that held the precious metal. Miners used fire to heat the rock face, then cracked it with sudden applications of cold water, a technique that allowed them to break apart the stubborn stone with iron tools. They descended into these treacherous tunnels, lit only by small oil lamps, to bring up the ore that would become the kingdom's primary currency. Once extracted, the gold-bearing rock was crushed and painstakingly panned in nearby streams, separating the heavy, gleaming flakes from the worthless dirt. This was a dangerous and labor-intensive process, but the reward was a substance that would open doors to the entire world. The gold was then transformed by master artisans. While much of it was traded in raw form, a significant amount was worked locally into exquisite objects of art and status. Craftsmen used clay crucibles and blowpipes to melt the gold, casting it into intricate forms or hammering it into thin sheets. They created delicate beads, bracelets, and pendants, often adorned with fine wirework. These pieces were not just decoration, they were a physical manifestation of power. When a ruler or elite member of the community wore this gold, they were literally displaying the kingdom's wealth on their body. It was a walking advertisement of the state's economic might and its access to superior craftsmanship. But the true power of this gold was realized when it entered the trade networks. A single gram could purchase a handful of the coveted glass beads from India. A small gold ingot could be traded for a beautiful piece of Chinese porcelain or a length of fine Indian cotton cloth. This system of exchange solidified the ruler's prestige in two crucial ways. First, by controlling the mines and the flow of gold, the king held the ultimate economic lever. He could tax the production, decide who could trade it, and amass a personal fortune that dwarfed all others. Second, the exotic goods acquired through this trade were then redistributed to loyal chiefs and supporters, cementing their allegiance. A Persian bowl or a string of foreign beads was not just a gift, it was a symbol of the king's far-reaching connections and his ability to provide access to a wider, more glamorous world. The ruler's power was thus built on a golden foundation, both literally and politically. But even a mountain of gold cannot protect a kingdom from the slow, inexorable pressures of change. What unseen forces could possibly topple a society so wealthy, so deeply rooted, and so brilliantly engineered? Perched atop monolithic stone pillars, silent sentinels gazed out over the city. These are the Zimbabwe birds, perhaps the most iconic and enigmatic symbols of the entire kingdom. Carved from dense soapstone, each bird stands about 16 inches tall, a unique fusion of animal features that has puzzled historians for generations. The creature has the unmistakable crest and powerful beak of a bird of prey, yet its lips are carved in a distinct, almost human-like curve. Its wings are folded tightly against its body, and its legs are thick and columnar, ending in 4 sharp talons on each foot. Most strikingly, the torso is decorated with a pattern of fine, scaly markings, blurring the line between bird and reptile. This singular design was clearly not meant to be a simple representation of a common animal. So what mysterious creature were the master carvers of Great Zimbabwe trying to depict? The most compelling theory points to the Batelor eagle, a majestic bird native to the region. The Batelor's distinctive featherless legs and its habit of holding its wings in a deep V shape in flight align closely with the carving's posture. For a civilization so deeply connected to the land, choosing a powerful and revered raptor as a royal emblem makes perfect sense. Yet the human-like lips and the scaled texture suggest something more, a symbolic being that transcends the natural world. This points to a second, even more profound interpretation. Within Shona spiritual tradition, these birds are widely understood as Shiri Yamadzitek Guru messenger birds of the ancestral spirits. They were not merely decorative. They were physical conduits, a sacred link between the living king and the spiritual world of his forefathers. Placed high on the walls of the hill complex, these carvings would have served as a constant, visible reminder that the ruler's authority was divinely sanctioned and protected. The birds were the guardians of the kingdom's soul, watching over a society whose prosperity depended on this sacred connection, but the silence of these guardians was shattered. In the late 19th century, a European treasure hunter named Willy Posselt arrived at the ruins. Recognizing their value, he forcibly removed one of the birds, prying it from its ancient pillar. He later sold it to a collector in South Africa, setting off a scramble that would see nearly all of the other 7 known birds looted from the site. Today, these national treasures are scattered far from their home. 6 of the birds reside in a museum in Zimbabwe, a testament to their eventual repatriation, but one remains thousands of miles away, housed in a museum in Cape Town. The 8th bird, taken by Posselt, made its way to Germany and was only returned after the country's reunification in the 20th century. The story of the Zimbabwe birds is thus a dual narrative. It is a tale of ancient spiritual belief and royal power, but it is equally a modern story of colonial appropriation and the long, ongoing struggle to reclaim a pillaged heritage. Why do you think these specific carvings, more than the walls themselves, became such potent symbols worth fighting to recover and protect for over a century? Within the Great Enclosure, the Conical Tower stands as a silent, stubborn riddle. This solid stone structure, rising over 30 feet tall, is a masterpiece of engineering, yet its purpose was never written down. Its very form offers the first and most obvious clue, a shape instantly recognizable to the people who built it. The tower is a perfect, monumental replica of the humble grain silo, the mud and thatch granaries used by Shona farmers for generations. This has led many to believe it was a powerful, permanent symbol of the kingdom's wealth and prosperity. In a world where a good harvest meant the difference between life and death, a stone granary that could never be emptied was a brilliant declaration. It told every citizen that their king commanded the land's fertility and held the power to feed his people through any hardship. It was an economic statement carved in stone. But could such a prominent structure have held a deeper, more spiritual meaning? Some scholars point to its shape as a potential phallic symbol, a representation of male potency and fertility intended to ensure the prosperity of both the land and the people. This theory connects the tower to the cyclical renewal of life, a core concern for any agricultural society dependent on the rains and the soil. Then there is the astronomical possibility. The precise placement and orientation of the tower and its surrounding walls have prompted investigations into whether it served as a sophisticated calendar. Certain alignments may have marked the solstices or the arrival of the rainy season, allowing priest-kings to predict celestial events and thereby demonstrate a divine connection to the very forces of nature. This would have given them immense authority, turning the tower into a tool of both science and power. With no written records to confirm a single purpose, the most compelling answer is likely a fusion of all these ideas. The Conical Tower was probably not just one thing. It was a multi-layered symbol, its meaning as complex as the society that built it. It represented economic security, spiritual belief, and royal authority all at once, a physical anchor for the kingdom's identity. Why would a civilization invest so much labor and skill into a structure whose true function they took such care to keep secret from us? The tower's enduring mystery is a testament to the fact that some truths are meant to be felt, not simply explained. The city was a living organism, its daily rhythm pulsing from the royal hill down to the humblest homestead. For the elite living within the stone-walled enclosures, life was one of relative comfort and clear status. Their round, mud brick houses, known as dogger huts, stood within these private yards, their interiors cool and dark, insulated from the savanna sun. Here, families ate from finely finished pottery, some decorated with intricate patterns, and stored their grain in large, secure pits. The air in these compounds would have carried the scent of cooking, with stews made from beef, goat, and mutton, supplemented by grains like sorghum and millet grown in the surrounding fields. This was a life where social standing was performed daily, where receiving guests in your walled compound was a display of your place in the city's intricate hierarchy. Beyond the grand stone walls, the city spread out into a vast settlement of commoners. Thousands of dogger huts clustered in family groups dotted the valley and the hillsides. These homes, built with wooden frames plastered with mud and topped with thick thatch roofs, were the dwellings of the farmers, herdsmen, and laborers who formed the backbone of the kingdom. Their daily lives were tied to the land and their livestock. Men tended to vast herds of cattle, the true measure of a family's wealth, while women managed the crops, processed the grain, and prepared the meals. The diet here was plainer but nourishing, centered on the staple porridge made from sorghum, accompanied by wild greens, beans, and occasionally meat from hunted game or a communal feast. The air over the entire city would have been thick with the smells and sounds of industry. In specialized workshops, the clang of iron hammers rang out as smiths forged tools, weapons, and elegant copper jewelry in hot, charcoal-fed fires. Potters coiled and shaped clay into vessels of all sizes, from massive grain storage jars to delicate, polished drinking cups which they fired in open kilns. The quiet, focused scraping of soapstone carvers created the ritual bowls and the iconic birds for the elite. Meanwhile, the chatter of spinners and weavers filled other spaces as they transformed locally grown cotton into valuable cloth. This was not a quiet, solemn place, but a bustling, vibrant capital. Paths between the compounds would have been alive with people moving to their fields, children playing, and traders negotiating. The social fabric was woven through nightly gatherings where stories were told. Local beer was shared, and music from drums and embiras, those thumb pianos with their haunting metallic tones, filled the air. How different must the view of the city have been from the King's Hill compared to the view from a farmer's hut? Yet both perspectives were essential, two halves of a single, thriving civilization whose collapse seems, from our modern vantage point, almost unthinkable. The true strength of Great Zimbabwe lay not just in its stones, but in the sophisticated political machine that operated within them. At the very top of this hierarchy stood the Mambo, a king whose authority was both absolute and divinely sanctioned. He was far more than a political leader. He was the spiritual linchpin of the entire kingdom, believed to be the primary intermediary between the living world and the ancestral spirits. This sacred connection gave his rule an unquestionable legitimacy, making his decrees not merely law but the will of the gods themselves. His court was a carefully balanced ecosystem of power. Surrounding the Mambo were his senior wives, royal advisors, and powerful religious figures, each playing a crucial role in governance. The spirit mediums, in particular, held immense influence as they were the channels through which the ancestral will was interpreted, advising the king on everything from when to go to war to when to plant the crops. This inner circle lived in close proximity to the ruler, likely within the elite enclosures on the hill, their physical location a constant reminder of their status. But how did the Mambo project his power over such a vast territory? The kingdom was not a monolithic state governed directly from the capital. Instead, it was a network of tributary chiefs who ruled over outlying provinces and subordinate towns. These chiefs were local leaders who had sworn allegiance to the Mambo in Great Zimbabwe. In return for their loyalty, they were granted a degree of autonomy to manage their own people. Their primary obligation was to send tribute to the capital. This was not simply a tax, it was a continuous flow of wealth that fueled the heart of the empire. Caravans would regularly arrive bearing ivory, gold dust, cattle, and grain, all tangible proof of a chief's fealty. This system created a powerful cycle of mutual benefit. A loyal chief would be rewarded by the mambo with prestige goods, like imported Chinese porcelain or fine cloth, symbols that elevated his status above his rivals back home. This gift was a public display of the king's favor and his far-reaching trade connections. However, a chief who withheld tribute or showed ambition risked a swift and decisive response. The mambo could dispatch royal regiments to enforce his will, replace the disloyal chief with a more compliant relative, or simply cut off the flow of coveted luxury goods, undermining that chief's local authority. Power was thus maintained through a masterful combination of spiritual awe, economic incentive, and the ever-present threat of royal force. The king's control over the long-distance trade routes was his ultimate strategic weapon. By holding the keys to the global marketplace, he made the entire political system dependent on his central role. Every chief knew that their own prosperity was inextricably linked to their good standing with the mambo in his stone city on the hill. This intricate political structure, woven from faith, fear, and commerce, created a stable and expansive kingdom. But such a delicate balance is always vulnerable to shock. What internal strain or external pressure could possibly cause this entire network of power to unravel and collapse? The spiritual world of Great Zimbabwe was as real and present as its stone walls. At the heart of their belief was Enigma, a supreme creator god who was seen as the ultimate source of all life and reign. But Enigma was a distant, powerful force, not approached directly by ordinary people. Instead, the Shona connected with the divine through their ancestors, the Vadzimu. These were not forgotten ghosts, but active spiritual guardians who watched over their living families, intervening in daily life to offer protection, guidance, or, if offended, misfortune. This belief made death not an end, but a transition to a more powerful state of being. The king's own ancestors, the royal Mhundoro spirits, were considered the most powerful of all, responsible for the entire kingdom's welfare, from the fertility of the land to the success of its armies. This is why the hill complex was far more than a royal palace. It was the nation's primary ritual center, a sacred space where the living king could commune with these potent royal spirits. The narrow, controlled passages leading to the summit were designed not just for defense, but to create a journey of increasing sanctity, separating the profane world of the valley from the holy realm atop the hill. Here, in secluded enclosures built amongst the ancient boulders, the king and his spirit mediums would perform ceremonies, offering prayers and sacrifices of beer or cattle to honor the ancestors and seek their blessings for rain, good harvest, and victory in war. How would the sound of ritual drums echoing from that hill have sounded to a farmer tending his fields below? It was a constant auditory reminder that the king's power was divinely backed. This deep interconnection meant that religion could not be separated from politics or daily life. A king who failed to secure the ancestors' favor through proper rituals risked drought, famine, and the collapse of his rule. His legitimacy depended on his perceived ability to mediate between the physical and spiritual worlds. For the common person, this belief system provided a moral framework and an explanation for life's uncertainties. A successful harvest was a sign of ancestral blessing, while a personal illness might be traced to a neglected ritual or a broken taboo. From the grand ceremonies on the hill to the small offerings made at a family homestead, spirituality was the invisible mortar that held the entire society together, a force as foundational to the kingdom's identity as the very stones they built with. The secret to the wall's endurance lies not in magic but in method. Every granite block was a puzzle piece meticulously selected from the surrounding hills. Quarrying was the first act of transformation. Workers would identify natural fractures in the granite outcrops, then use fire to heat the rock surface. Once the stone was hot, they doused it with cold water, causing the thermal shock to crack it along clean, predictable lines. This ingenious technique allowed them to pry free manageable slabs without the need for metal wedges or explosives. These raw blocks were then the canvas for the stonemasons. Using nothing but harder river stones as hammers, they patiently battered and pecked the granite, shaping each block into a rough rectangle. The final, most crucial step was the fitting. Masons would place a new block against its neighbor and rub them together, grinding the surfaces until they locked into place with near-perfect contact. This process, known as dressing, created a custom fit so precise that the friction alone held the walls together, defying gravity and time. You can still see the telltale shine on some stone faces today, a polished testimony to this ancient rubbing technique. The walls themselves tell a story of evolving skill. The earliest constructions are rougher, with smaller, less uniform stones and a simpler construction style. But as the builders' confidence grew, so did their ambition. Later phases showcased the stunning chevron patterns and the famous freestanding curves, feats that required an advanced understanding of physics and aesthetics. This progression in the stonework is like a visible timeline, charting the rise of a civilization from capable builders to unparalleled masters of their craft. Why did they invest such incredible effort into a technique that required no binding agent? The answer is in the wall's resilience. Without mortar, the structures could flex and shift during minor earthquakes or ground settlement, settling back into place instead of cracking apart. A mortared wall would have shattered, but these dry stone walls simply breathed with the land, a testament to a profound understanding of their environment. What other secrets of sustainable engineering might we learn from these ancient stones? Even the most magnificent civilizations are not immune to the slow, creeping pressures of change. So what mysterious forces conspired to empty the stone city of Great Zimbabwe? The most compelling theory points to a silent, relentless enemy, a changing climate. A series of severe and prolonged droughts could have crippled the agricultural foundation of the entire kingdom. Imagine the life-giving rivers shrinking to mere trickles, the once fertile fields turning to dust. A society that fed thousands would have faced famine, forcing communities to disperse in search of water and arable land. This environmental stress would have been compounded by the very success of the city itself. A century of supporting a large, dense population and vast herds of cattle likely led to severe deforestation and overgrazing. The land itself may have simply given out, exhausted by the demands of a thriving metropolis. But was nature the only culprit? Another possibility lies in the very source of the kingdom's wealth. The gold mines that funded its glory may have been worked to exhaustion. As the most accessible veins ran dry, the economic engine of the state would have begun to sputter. This could have triggered a cascade of political instability. The regional chiefs, whose loyalty was purchased with tribute and luxury goods, would have grown restless as the flow of wealth from the capital slowed to a halt. Why remain loyal to a Mambo who could no longer deliver the exotic porcelain and fine cloth that proved his power? Internal rivalries and succession disputes could have fractured the delicate political alliance that held the kingdom together. Finally, the world outside was changing. New trade routes may have opened up, bypassing Great Zimbabwe entirely. If merchants found a more direct or profitable path to the gold fields and ivory stocks of the interior, the city would have lost its crucial role as the central commercial hub. Its strategic advantage would have evaporated overnight. The truth is, no single theory provides a perfect answer. It was likely a perfect storm of these factors, a slow unraveling where environmental strain weakened the political structure just as economic foundations were shifting. The people did not vanish, they simply moved on, likely establishing smaller, more sustainable chiefdoms elsewhere. The great stone city was not destroyed by invasion or cataclysm, but was gradually, thoughtfully abandoned, its secrets left for the stones to keep. What does the quiet departure of a people from their greatest creation tell us about the delicate balance that sustains any civilization? The stones held their truth, but a new wave of outsiders arrived with a very different agenda. The late 19th century brought the ambitions of empire, personified by the ruthless capitalist Cecil Rhodes and his British South Africa Company. Rhodes saw the ruins not as a historical wonder, but as a political opportunity. He and his company actively promoted the false narrative of a non-African origin for Great Zimbabwe, claiming it was an ancient Phoenician outpost or the work of King Solomon's mines. This was not just academic curiosity, it was a calculated strategy. By denying the site's African origins, they could argue that the land had no sophisticated native civilization, thereby legitimizing their own colonial seizure of the territory and its resources. The myth was a weapon used to justify displacement and control. The company went so far as to license treasure hunters who dynamited sections of the ruins in a frantic search for gold, irreparably damaging archaeological layers and scattering priceless context to the winds. For decades, the official guidebook to the site, published by the colonial government of southern Rhodesia, explicitly stated that the ruins were not the product of the local Shona people. This institutionalized lie was a deliberate act of historical theft, an attempt to sever a people from their own magnificent past, but the truth has a stubborn way of persisting. A growing chorus of African scholars and archaeologists like Peter Garlake began to challenge this colonial fiction. They meticulously pieced together the evidence from pottery styles to settlement patterns, building an irrefutable case for the site's indigenous origins. This was not merely an academic debate, it was a profound act of reclamation. For the emerging nation, which would take the ancient city's name upon its independence, asserting the truth of Great Zimbabwe became a foundational act of cultural and political identity. The fight to correct the historical record was a fight for the very soul of a nation. Why do you think those in power so often feel the need to rewrite the past before they can claim the future? That stubborn fight to reclaim a stolen history culminated in one powerful, symbolic act. When the nation won its hard-fought independence, it chose a name that would echo through the ages: Zimbabwe. The word itself comes from the Shona term Zimbabwe, meaning houses of stone, a direct and proud reference to the ancient capital. This was far more than a simple choice of a name, it was a declaration. It stated for the entire world to hear that this land had a deep, glorious history long before any colonizer set foot on it, and that its people were the direct heirs to that legacy. The new nation then embedded this identity into the very fabric of daily life. Look at the national flag and you will see the iconic Zimbabwe bird rendered in red and perched atop a red star. This ancient soapstone guardian, once looted as a trophy, was now flying high as the premier symbol of national sovereignty. It appears again on the country's currency, a constant reminder in every transaction of the enduring strength and artistry of the ancestors. This reclamation transforms the ruins from a mere archaeological site into a living, breathing source of pride. For every citizen, the story of Great Zimbabwe is not a forgotten tale, it is the foundational epic of their nation. It is a story of innovation, of economic power, and of spiritual depth that stands as a timeless rebuke to any narrative of pre-colonial emptiness. The stones, once used to deny a people their past, are now the bedrock of their national identity. What does it mean for a country to draw its modern strength from the silent, enduring power of ancient stones? The first excavations at Great Zimbabwe were less about science and more about treasure. In the early 1900s, guided by colonial myths of King Solomon's mines, teams like the one funded by Cecil Rhodes tore into the ancient ground. They used dynamite and shovels in a frantic hunt for gold, blasting through priceless archaeological layers and tossing aside artifacts that held no immediate monetary value. These early digs were an act of vandalism, scattering the site's history to the winds and leaving a legacy of confusion that took decades to untangle. It was not until the mid-20th century that a more disciplined approach finally arrived. archaeologists like Gertrude Catton Thompson and later Roger Summers began the slow, meticulous work of proper excavation, carefully sifting through the soil to read the story it held. Their work was a quiet revolution, systematically dismantling the racist myths that had clouded the site for so long. What did these patient scientists find when they finally looked with clear eyes and careful hands? They uncovered the undeniable proof of a global power. From the deepest, oldest layers of the hill complex, they pulled forth fragments of fine celadon pottery from the kilns of China, its pale green glaze shimmering even after centuries in the earth. They found delicate shards of glassware not from local sources but from the workshops of Persia and the Arab world, and everywhere they discovered beads. Thousands upon thousands of tiny glass beads, some a deep indigo, others a vibrant yellow, chemically traced to origins in India and even Southeast Asia. These were not the trinkets of an isolated tribe, they were the luxury imports of a sophisticated elite, the material evidence of trade routes that spanned the entire Indian Ocean. Each broken piece of pottery, each single bead, was a silent witness to the dhows that sailed from the Swahili coast, their holds filled with the world's riches, all destined for the court of the Mambo. These artifacts were the final, irrefutable evidence that Great Zimbabwe was not a backward mystery, but the cosmopolitan heart of a vast commercial empire. How many more stories are still buried in the earth, waiting for a careful hand to uncover them? Look closely at the walls and you will see their language. Etched into the granite are intricate geometric patterns, a silent code waiting to be read. The most prominent of these is the chevron, a continuous line of sharp V-shapes running along the top of the great walls like a stone crown. Another common pattern is the cord, a design that mimics the twisted fibers of a rope, often framing doorways or marking important corners. These were not random decorations scratched in by bored builders. They were a deliberate and sophisticated visual language, a public declaration carved in stone for everyone to see. But what message were they trying to send? One powerful interpretation is that these patterns served as a form of heraldry, a way to signify clan identity or social status. In a kingdom built on a network of loyal chiefs, perhaps each major family or guild had its own signature pattern displayed on their section of the wall. Seeing a specific chevron design might have immediately told a visitor which powerful official lived within that enclosure, much like a family crest on a medieval European castle. The patterns could also communicate spiritual beliefs. The repeated upward-pointing V of the chevron might symbolize a connection to the ancestral world or represent the sacred mountains where spirits were believed to reside. The cord pattern, resembling a tied rope, could signify unity, binding the community together or symbolizing the connection between the physical and spiritual realms. These symbols transformed a defensive wall into a narrative. They told a story of a complex society where your identity, your lineage, and your beliefs were not private matters, but were proudly integrated into the very architecture of the city. The stones do more than just stand, they speak, and their message is one of a people deeply connected to each other, to their leaders, and to a world of meaning that extended far beyond the physical. What stories would your own home tell if its walls could speak? The evidence for who truly built this city is not a matter of speculation, but a mountain of facts patiently uncovered. To claim that outsiders constructed Great Zimbabwe is to ignore the very ground it stands upon. Every archaeological dig, every linguistic clue, and every artifact tells the same consistent story of local genius. The earliest pottery found at the site, for instance, shows a direct stylistic evolution from the ceramics made by the Gokoma people, who had lived on that very plateau for centuries before the first stones were ever laid. This is not a sudden foreign import, but the slow, organic development of a local craft into something magnificent. The tools they used, the iron adzes and hammers, were forged in local furnaces using techniques perfected over generations. Even the soapstone used for the famous bird carvings was quarried from a nearby hill, not shipped from across an ocean. The entire material culture, from the smallest clay spindle wall to the largest granite block, is undeniably uniquely African. Why would Phoenician traders or a lost tribe of Israel suddenly adopt the exact building styles, pottery designs, and spiritual symbols of the local Shona people, only to then vanish without a trace from the historical record elsewhere? The logic of the colonial myth collapses under its own absurd weight. This was not a borrowed or imported civilization. It was a homegrown triumph, the culmination of centuries of African social, economic, and technological development on the Zimbabwean plateau. The stones themselves cry out their origin if we are only willing to listen. Walking through the ruins today, you can still feel the logic of its design. The hill complex, the Great Enclosure, and the valley settlements were not isolated districts but interconnected parts of a single, brilliant urban plan. The entire city was organized along a clear vertical axis of power and purpose. At the summit sat the spiritual and royal center, a place of ritual and governance. Directly below it, the Great Enclosure served as the elite royal precinct, a space for the inner court and its ceremonies. Farther out, the valley enclosures housed the supporting aristocracy. This was not a haphazard collection of buildings. It was a three-dimensional diagram of the kingdom's social order, carved into the very landscape. The connections between these zones were deliberate and controlled. Pathways and stairways, some narrow and easily defended, others more processional, created specific routes for movement. A common farmer would have known his place, likely never ascending the sacred passages to the hill complex. An elite official, however, could move freely between the valley and the Great Enclosure, his access a visible sign of his status. This sophisticated zoning managed the flow of people, goods, and power, preventing chaos in a city that may have housed nearly 20,000 residents at its peak. How does a society coordinate the construction of such a vast, integrated city without blueprints or written plans? The answer lies in a shared spatial intelligence, a common understanding of social hierarchy and function that was so ingrained it became architecture. Every path, every wall, and every vantage point was engineered to reinforce the structure of the society itself, making the city not just a place to live, but a physical manifestation of the kingdom's unwavering order. The true scale of their world is revealed in the shattered pieces left behind. In the soil of the royal enclosures, archaeologists have unearthed fragments of a delicate sea-green pottery known as celadon, its glaze still luminous after centuries buried in African earth. This was no local craft. Each shard was fired in a kiln in distant China, a product of the sophisticated Song dynasty. It likely traveled thousands of miles on a Dhow sailing ship, crossing the Indian Ocean to the Swahili coast before being carried inland by caravan to its final resting place in the heart of Zimbabwe. Alongside it, they found remnants of Persian faience, bowls decorated with intricate cobalt blue patterns, whispering of artistic traditions from the workshops of the Middle East. But perhaps the most telling treasures are the smallest. The earth is littered with thousands of tiny glass beads in vibrant shades of cobalt, yellow, and red. Chemical analysis traces their origins to the glass-making centers of India, and some even as far as Southeast Asia. These were not mere trinkets. A single, deep blue Indian bead was a concentrated form of wealth, a status symbol worn as jewelry that proclaimed the wearer's connection to a world of exotic luxury. What does this collection of global artifacts tell us? It paints a picture of a capital city that was a deliberate and savvy participant in a medieval global economy. The rulers of Great Zimbabwe were not passive recipients of foreign goods. They were active consumers with cosmopolitan tastes. They understood the power of these objects as political tools. A Chinese bowl or a string of Indian beads was more than a beautiful possession. It was a symbol of the king's far-reaching influence. By distributing these exotic luxuries to loyal chiefs, the Mambo was not just giving a gift, he was granting access to a global network, solidifying alliances with the tangible proof of his economic reach. The presence of these items transforms the ruins from an isolated African marvel into a connected hub on the map of the ancient world. How many hands from how many different cultures must each of these objects have passed through before they came to rest here in this city of stone? Preserving these ancient whispers of stone is a constant battle against the elements. The very rain that once gave life to the kingdom now threatens its remains, seeping into cracks and slowly prying the granite blocks apart. The roots of beautiful, towering trees and tenacious shrubs can act like natural crowbars, disrupting foundations that have stood for 800 years. And then there is the pressure of their own fame. The footfall of thousands of admiring visitors each year, while a testament to the site's enduring power, gradually wears down ancient pathways and stresses fragile structures. The challenge for modern conservators is a delicate one: how to allow people to experience this wonder while ensuring it survives for generations yet to come. Their work is one of meticulous respect. They do not rebuild but instead stabilize, using traditional methods and materials that match the original construction. They carefully reset dislodged stones, ensuring the repairs are both structurally sound and visually harmonious. This philosophy of minimal intervention means a repaired section should be detectable to a trained eye, but it does not create a false, pristine version of the past. It honors the authentic age and history of the ruins. This leads to a difficult question every day: where you draw the line between access and preservation. Guiding visitors along designated paths protects the most fragile archaeology hidden just beneath the soil. Installing discreet handrails helps prevent accidental damage from countless hands seeking support. These are not restrictions meant to diminish the experience, but essential protections for a non-renewable resource. The goal is not to seal the city away in a bubble, but to steward it wisely. How do we protect a monument that belongs not just to one nation, but to the shared history of all humanity? The silent stones of Great Zimbabwe have weathered centuries of change, and their continued survival now depends on the careful, conscious choices we make today. The kingdom's influence did not crumble with the abandonment of its stone capital. Its legacy flowed outward, carried by the people who moved on, seeding new empires that would dominate southern Africa for centuries. The most direct successor was the Mutapa Empire, which rose to power further north. Its rulers claimed direct descent from the royal lineage of Great Zimbabwe, a powerful political statement that legitimized their authority. They inherited and expanded upon the same economic blueprint, taking control of the gold and ivory trade routes that stretched to the coast. While they built less in stone, their political structure was a direct echo of the Mambo's system, a network of tribute and loyalty held together by spiritual authority and control of commerce. Then came the Rozwi Empire, which emerged later and explicitly saw itself as the restorer of the original Zimbabwean legacy. The Rozwi Changamire rulers consciously revived the stone-building tradition, constructing impressive dry stone walls at sites like Kami and Danangam. Their very name, Rozwi, is thought to mean destroyers, reflecting their military might, but their true achievement was cultural. They reassembled the scattered pieces of the old kingdom, re-establishing a centralized state that once again controlled the interior trade and championed Shona culture. This was not a simple repetition, but an evolution. The stonework at Kami, for instance, became even more decorative, featuring intricate checkered and herringbone patterns that showed a development of the original artistic vision from Great Zimbabwe. Why does this matter? Because it proves that Great Zimbabwe was not a solitary, mysterious fluke. It was the mother culture, the foundational prototype for a political and cultural tradition that shaped southern Africa for over 500 years after its decline. Its architectural style, its trade networks, and its model of sacred kingship became a lasting blueprint for power. The stone city was not an endpoint but a beginning. Its greatest legacy is not the silent walls we see today, but the living, breathing civilizations that grew from its example, carrying its spirit deep into the history of a continent. Great Zimbabwe stands as a permanent testament to African ingenuity. This was a civilization that mastered its environment, raising a city of stone without mortar to touch the sky. It commanded a trade network that spanned oceans, turning African gold and ivory into a conduit for global connection. And at its heart, it wove a spiritual belief so strong that it sanctified the very stones. Yet for all we have uncovered, the silent guardians of the past, the Conical Tower and the soapstone birds, hold fast to their final secrets, reminding us that some mysteries are meant to endure. This is more than a collection of ruins. It is a foundational chapter in human history, a World Heritage Site that belongs to all of us. Its preservation is a shared responsibility, a promise to future generations that they too will feel the awe of standing before these walls. We would love to hear which part of this incredible story resonated with you the most. Was it the global trade, the spiritual beliefs, or the enduring mystery of its abandonment? Share your thoughts and help keep the story of this African marvel alive.